Work of UK-based NGOs with a focus on water, related to water and sanitation, but also sometimes water resource management. And we pulled together this event because over the last year we've been having a number of conversations with DFID, and either brilliantly or frustratingly, we tend to agree on the same points a lot of the time. Which is nice, obviously, to work together with them. But we also thought there was an opportunity for the UK Water Network really to drill down on some of the issues that maybe needs a bit more work in the sector. Some of those questions that we haven't really answered. And this was the first opportunity that came up. And really, at this point, I want to say a big thanks to Jonathan Parkinson and Lucy Stevens, who have put a huge amount of work into organising this event. It turns out that these are not that simple to put on, and they do take a lot of effort, and that's really been driven forward by them. So maybe we can give them a little round of applause. Okay, so moving swiftly on, we're doing a summary because we do hope to have some viable outputs from this workshop in the form of a policy document, which we will share with DFID, and this will be representative of our collective thoughts on urban sanitation markets. So it is, in fact, very important that you listen in case your views are misrepresented by us. This is your chance to say, no, that was not what we said. So throughout the workshop today, we've been taking notes in each session, and we've tried to keep it to 3 key points in each session of what we thought were the primary issues that stood out to us once, but we heard you repeating a lot throughout the session. So starting with the opening presentation, setting the scene. So there were some points around behavioural change matters in markets. We need to understand the barriers. Setting out that sanitation is a public good with high social returns. And what role does the private sector have to play with this? And how do you incentivise market entry? Incentives, incentivization, incentivize was a phrase that came up frequently through this. So hopefully we're coming up with some answers to that. And then what do we mean by market scale resilience? We heard from Nat that markets are a network. We need vertical and horizontal integration. That there is a tension between NGOs and private sector. How do we manage this transition from grants to commercial finance, and how do we support SMEs and other entrepreneurs to engage in that? And the key factors about balance, aim, and patience. I should say at this point, if you see any typos, please forgive us. These are live documents, so we will go back and update them if needs be. So what do we mean by market scale resilience in urban sanitation? Some of the key points here, the support of governments in providing public financing and providing enabling environments is critical. That was really a point we heard a lot during this session. Diversity in the delivery of services is important through a coordinated and networked sector supports resilience, and hopefully this will lead on to some of the later sessions. Diversity in a stable environment is an indicator of a potential of a market to have resilience in a crisis. Equality in markets, how do we ensure that we're reaching the poorest and the most vulnerable? Can a market environment achieve equity for the most vulnerable? Can entrepreneurs be equipped to support vulnerability and inequality analysis? I'm not sure if that was something we necessarily came up with an answer to, so maybe more thought there is needed. We had some presentations. An enabling environment is key. It's not just about public finance. There are barriers. We need to level the playing field and catalyse the market. A change approach. The NGO relationship and experience is not directly transferable. We need to learn from our mistakes, such as designing financing terms couldn't be
So this is Ada's presentation, so for not really understanding the different financing terms that you are using if you're adopting a market approach, I think was the key learning that was being brought out there. The grantee-grantor relationship is not, doesn't cut it in this context, I think.
Great. And partnership is essential to facilitating markets. We had some great analogies about dating sites, about marriage counselling. I hope those will all come back to you. There's some highlights for me. Opportunities and barriers for engaging with market actors were panel debate. The panel spoke about coordinating with other sectors, including housing, can help support municipalities and municipality planning for citywide sanitation services. So very much in line with the SDGs, talking about how we can integrate across goals. We need to restrict ourselves to goals across markets, across sectors. You know, this is all about integration and engaging in those other markets going forward. I think that's my continuity of the citywide approach. Yes, this was the question about political support. In the wonderful democratic systems we have, when we spend 3.5 years engaging political support, only to see our champion move on shortly after. Do we want to go for the dictatorial approach? I think was that put forward by WaterAid? Maybe not. But we did talk about the continuity of a citywide approach, and do we rely on one leader, or do we work within the technocrats within that system? And again, here comes incentives, understanding incentives and helping to address these while raising needs for sanitation. So I think there was an example given, if we're asking a city to provide sanitation services, well, should we be helping them to think about where they're going to get the financing for that? What are the opportunities for kind of reducing inefficiencies such as non-revenue water? Sanitation market analysis and strengthening presentations. We need to redirect municipality financing to other parts of the chain to have smarter incentives. NGO roles need to change to be facilitators rather than implementers or funders. I think this was a point brought up by Lucy, and the ever-evolving NGO sector. We need to constantly reflect on what role we're playing in development and humanitarian response, and how effective we are in that role. Developed NGOs need to think about what happens to the structures they're building after a shock. So this is building into the resilience. Humanitarian responses should address basic needs and rebuild markets to support resilience and disaster recovery. Undermining existing markets will only hinder long-term recovery. And I think this is one of the strong points coming through at the end, the links between the humanitarian developments are increasing, and development projects need to plan for resilience. I think traditionally in this sector, probably from its initial development, there was a humanitarian response, and from that we transitioned to a development scenario. I think going forward we're going to be looking at situations where we have perhaps a development scenario which faces an ongoing series of crises, whether that be climate change, conflict, all the challenges that we're facing now. And so it's much more important that we're thinking of resilience and thinking of being able to respond to crises when we're doing our development planning, as well as humanitarian agencies thinking about the transition to development. And I think this is the final one, working with markets to bridge the development and humanitarian divide. So following on from the last point, political economy and institutional assessments are key in understanding the private sector context in humanitarian crises. Research can support in this. This was B's point. We really need to understand what we're dealing with. I think this is a general point, but we need to understand how those markets operate and where we can make those effective interventions, and using the underlying do no harm approach. Strengthen linkages and knowledge exchange between humanitarian development agencies, repetition, and prepare markets to be resilient in the event of a shock. So I think those last 2 points are really some of the key learnings coming out of that session. So those were the highlights as we saw them. Just maybe open it up to you to say, have we missed the point? Is there anything that shouldn't be up there? Is there anything that should be up there in addition? What can we add? Yes.
Bear in mind that we had to cut some things. Okay, Lucy was first up, and then.
Thank you. My goodness, you've been working super hard to pull those points together. Great. And it's not really a specific thing about the points that you've raised, but I think it would be really great to put this in a context which says that, I think it's been really exciting today to see us all here talking about this issue, but this is still in a context where the issue of urban poverty and sanitation is still a bit the poor relation, which I think was mentioned by somebody again. So I think that's really true. So it's great to see the attention today, but it'd be great to see that translated, I guess, and in the context of what we write, that there needs to be, that focus needs to translate into government, an increased government focus, and perhaps a focus on the needs of the urban poor as well as rural communities that still need much improved access to wash. So what is it that should happen there? Maybe we're calling for things like a reorganisation of roles and responsibilities, the better use of existing resources by governments and municipalities, but also perhaps more focus and a bit more financing into the sector. But I think it's also about reorganisation of roles and responsibilities and, a better use of the existing resources. So I just thought it would be useful to put some of these points in that context when we write it up.
Thank you very much. It's Hugh Wemmonsmith. I'm a bit of an outsider in this, and I'd like to start by saying I'm being extraordinarily impressed by the quality of the contributions, because this is a highly practical subject, and all the people who've been contributing have made highly practical suggestions. They don't all agree, but it's firmly grounded, and that's an immense strength. I wanted to float an idea which has been forming in my mind about how to help you pull it together. A lot of good ideas have come up, but the position we're starting from is a bit of a mess. Lucy's referred to some of the sort of disarray. We have very active donor NGO interest in doing something here, strongly motivated. The private sector is responding a bit, but it's a very mixed picture, and some bits are not working at all well, and there have been some well-known disasters. On the government side, particularly I'm talking about local governments, national governments are not very engaged in this business. Municipal governments, local governments are beginning to be, but mostly they're extremely under-resourced and have great difficulty doing what they need to do. But nevertheless, a number of ideas have come up which can be built on. And my suggestion is that we start with some kind of vision for, say, a year like 2030. I mean, it's an arbitrary date, but it happens to be the end of the SDGs, as to, by that time, which is 15 years on, who should be doing what, roughly. And broadly, I think we hear NGOs and donors want to be backing off and becoming more like facilitators. The private sector needs to be strengthened in ways which I'm not sure we've really identified properly. But for my part, I'd throw in the idea there needs to be more interface between big actors and small actors. There's ways in which they can cooperate, and there will be synergies between them. For example, the utility provides the pipe and the small actor provides the water kiosk and equivalent arrangements on the dirty water side. As regards government, the idea of an enabling environment seemed to me to come through very strongly as to how you do that in a context of weak resources and not very many well-qualified people to help you do it. But I think that is obviously the direction of movement. I just add that it doesn't have to be one vision, because it has come out, cultures are different and the traditions are different, so maybe slightly different visions. But if you start with a vision some distance ahead, it's perhaps easier to go back to the actors we've got on the stage now and ask, well, what do they need to do to move in the direction of that vision, assuming we can find a good one. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Just 3-4 very quick comments. One is, I think the number of people sitting here, they have a great internal outreach of reaching their own staff And I suggest we must not ignore that potential. So whoever is sitting must be equipped with something exciting and interesting they can share with their team sitting in many parts of the world. And that's one thing which I suggest. Second, on the donors' engagement, yes, I know UK Water Network work and like to influence DFID, but I suggest this is very useful for a number of other donors. So we must not restrict ourselves to that. One question from DFID and donors like DFID is, okay, so what? Tell us what we can do. And probably in between the line, they say what we can do in 12 months or 6 months. So we need to be specific on some of the things that this is new.
There is another slide.
Okay, right. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead. So we can exactly say, inform them, give some ideas. And finally, my understanding is that Remy used housing as an example, but I think when we talk about integration, don't forget health and nutrition. They are important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A very good summary of it. One thing that I was impressed with today is a number of presentations that from NGOs that admitted their mistakes, that said this is where we got it wrong. And I think that any kind of position paper or policy paper that would emphasize the learning that's going on, I think would be of critical importance for DFID and for the general audience. And then the second thing that I'm missing, but maybe it was in an earlier slide and I've blanked out, but where's the issue of scale? Did we really talk about scale, or did we flirt around the edge? I think with resilience, we kind of got as close as we could in the time, but did we really address the issue of scale?
Yeah, just a question, reflection for me is maybe could we have looked in hindsight more about the financial models? Like we talked a lot about technologies, the process, the interactions and things, but it would have been good to have really an understanding or a flavour of where financial models have worked and the lessons, the challenges to do so. Because I think if we're trying to convince and convey an ideal or an ideology to the government, then if we share the capital costs and the operating costs, then I think they might buy into some of these things. So I think as practitioners, we could really embrace that, whether it's through case studies, papers, but also that could be a good entry point when speaking to respective government, municipal authorities and so forth.
Okay, so...
Sorry. Just firstly saying thanks for letting me come along from the private sector today. I think sometimes we're kind of crowded away from talking about the academic side of things. I think from what I've heard today, and this is within 3 months of WASH, I probably know less than everyone else in the room, there is a big role for private sector companies who operate in the humanitarian sphere to play in the development sphere. So whether that is introductions through NGOs and us creating partnerships on the ground with distribution rather than manufacture on the ground. We learn the lessons of resilience ourselves. We work in multiple sectors. How can we take more initiative in engaging with suppliers on the ground? I think Alexis put it back straight to me and said the onus is on us. But I just wanted to say thank you for kind of your information today, and I think we can take some real steps to help you out as well.
Okay, so as Tim said, there are more slides.
But not many.
Just 2 more, but just obviously we'll take on board all of those points, but we have also put together what we thought could go into the summary as well, so just to share that with you now.